Let's see. This is on pages 94 to 95 that give you this big chart of all the primates, all the classes of primates. There's so many primates. Way too many, in my opinion. Keep finding more of them. A lot of you like these wet-nosed primates over here. Strepsirrhines, lorises, and even the pygmy mouse lemur. There's some strange primates. We're not going to at all talk about those. If you're interested in those, you probably shouldn't even be in anthropology. You should be in some other biology class. They're way distant from human beings. We at least got to get into these dry-nosed primates over here. So I'm not sure why we're always classifying primates by their noses, but you have the wet-nosed primates, those really weird ones over there. They're very distant from humans, evolutionarily speaking. And then you have the group of dry-nosed primates over here, which we then divide into the flat-nosed primates, which are basically the monkeys that you see today in the Americas. So if you go to South America or Costa Rica, you can see some of these monkeys that are also pretty distant from human beings. They're not that close evolutionarily speaking. So some people go to South America and they look at, say, a spider monkey screeching along, being all weird. And they're like, that doesn't make sense. We couldn't have evolved from that. And in some ways, it's true. That's a long way away. That's like 40 million years ago that the divergence between the flat-nosed monkeys and the sharp-nosed monkeys took place. But when we get over here into the sharp-nosed monkeys and the hominoids, which includes the apes and the humans, you start to see a lot more of the evolutionarily and anatomical and, frankly, behavioral resemblances between some of these things. Again, I don't want to get into the trap of thinking we're just like any of these creatures, but they do start to look, sound, act a lot more similar to what we know of in our own species. So we have the New World monkeys over here, and then we have the monkeys of the Americas, the flat-nosed monkeys, and then we have the sharp-nosed monkeys like the colobus monkeys and the baboons. And then we start to get into the apes. So once we get into the apes, they give us a nice little chart then of what they call the hominoids. So then we see some of these evolutionary relationships. People start branching off around 9 to 13 million years ago. Orangutans, or the ancestors that would lead to our present day orangutans, branch off. And then you have the gorillas going out. And then you have this period that we'll be talking a lot about today of the last common ancestor between humans, chimpanzees, and we didn't know this for a long time, but between humans, chimpanzees, and the bonobos, they're super similar to human beings. Some people say are super close evolutionarily speaking to human beings. Let's put it that way. Some people claim that they're closer to us than the chimpanzees. That's not technically true. What happened is there was a speciation event or process that happened about 1 to 1.5 million years ago, where the chimpanzees that we know, or what are sometimes called the common chimpanzees, split off from the bonobos. And so we are actually, evolutionarily speaking, equally distant from each of these. So again, some people want to say we're closer to the bonobos, but you shouldn't necessarily believe them. Now, the bonobos, one of the things that the bonobos are funny. They're known for using sex. And they give you a different sense of how this split happens. We have the monkeys of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Remember the other monkeys of the Americas split off around now. Most people believe that they got to the Americas by floating on a giant vegetative raft that split off from the continent of Africa. But here, those monkeys are over here. So we have the monkeys of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Then we have gibbons, or the who are so-called lesser apes splitting off. And then, as I showed you, have the orangutan splitting off, the gorillas splitting off, and then the hominins splitting off from the creatures that would become both chimpanzees and bonobos. So that guy who was talking, it is true that the bonobos are more closely related to us than gorillas, genetically speaking and evolutionarily speaking. However, they're not necessarily more related to us than chimpanzees. And so there's a philosophical divide, you might say, in the primatological community. Chimpanzees, especially in captivity or in situations in which their resources are reduced, tend to be very hierarchical and fight each other. Even some people believe they engage in something like warfare. They have definitely been observed to use lethal violence on one another. And so a lot of people are like, aha, there it is. The chimpanzees were just like them. See, humans fight too. The bonobos, especially when they are in captivity and when their resources are limited or perhaps magnified because we give them more resources, we've never observed bonobos killing each other. There's never been lethal violence observed, nothing like what chimpanzees do. And as our author said, in a setting in which they get abundant food supplies, they diffuse tension through a very broad sexual repertoire. It's broader than many human beings. And so this is something that, again, they seem to use to diffuse tension. And so people who are into that say they're just like human beings. Human beings have sex non-reproductively, so that's what we do too. So, but as our photographer said, if you go into the wild, the sex stuff is much less frequent than it is in a zoo setting. The chimpanzees and the bonobos are both very smart, and they can learn a lot of stuff. They do a lot of social learning. They pass on the things they learn to their offspring, and they can learn from each other and from group to group. You mentioned the cognitive stuff. These are also the primates that have most been taught human sign language. And you can look online there's great YouTubes of Kanzi the bonobo, who knows 200 or 300 signs and can communicate and do different things with its human caretakers. Not really a huge, we'll talk more about that when we get to the language section, but yeah, there's a lot of both genetic, evolutionary, and even social similarity to human beings. We don't want to get into a trap that we're just like them, but yeah, this is definitely our closest primate relatives. So in today's class, we're going to start with the Hyclica, the HCLCA. What's that? Yes, the human-chimp last common ancestor. So in your textbook, they briefly refer to this as the missing link. As we'll talk about, we don't actually use the missing link as an outdated term, and we don't look for missing links because there are really no missing links. There are common ancestors or last common ancestors from which lineages develop. So we are interested in this period of time in which there was an ancestor which eventually would derive or would give way to or proliferate as and become these different species of eventually hominins, chimpanzees, and bonobos. We don't know what exactly the human-chimp last common ancestor looks like. This is an artist guessing at what it might have been like. Some people imagine something between a contemporary gorilla and a chimpanzee. The thing I will say about this is when we look back evolutionarily speaking at some of these things and we talk about how gorillas diverged 12 million years ago, the gorillas that we see today are not the same gorillas that were around 12 million years ago. So it's very important that you realize that all the creatures that we see today were evolving. There's a bunch of creatures that evolved that were there back then that aren't around today. And the ones that are still around are not the same as the creatures that were back then. So when we look at chimpanzees or bonobos of today, it's not like they got stuck, evolutionarily speaking, back there and then hominins kept going. They themselves have been changing and their adaptations have changed as well. And so a lot of say the characteristics of chimpanzees that can seem more violent or the bonobos that can seem more sexed up, a lot of those things may have developed after the evolutionarily divergence of the last, the human, the HCLCA. How long ago was this around? This is a little more recent than most of us were taught when I was growing up. It was more thought to be 10 to 12 million years ago, because it didn't seem like the changes that were required to get to some of the contemporary creatures could happen this quickly. We now know a little bit more about how evolution proceeds, and that it can sometimes proceed faster in evolutionary time than we once expected. So people now talk about evolutionary, they talk about punctuated equilibrium, where there are periods of time in which evolution can actually occur relatively quickly. And by relatively quickly, over hundreds of thousands of years as opposed to millions of years. But there's plenty of time for gradual change here. Let's see. How do we get that estimation? How do we know how long ago that was? The molecular clock method. So one of the things that I would caution you here is when we're talking about this human-chimp last common ancestor, there are actually not very many fossils around to date from this time period. These are very highly mobile creatures, and we just don't have a lot of fossil record on them. And even if we did, it would be very difficult to tell on which side of the divide they might belong. And so a lot of the estimations about how long this divergence was is by taking the genetic code of the creatures that exist today and the fossils that we do have, and then counting the number of mutations to try and go back over time to figure out the number of changes that might have occurred, and then get a more accurate divergence time. What we see is that over this time period, when I say 6 to 9 million years ago, we see a gradual divergence between the creatures that would be more hominin-like and the creatures that we would classify as more ape-like. So speciation is not something that happens overnight or instantaneously. A lot of creatures drift together and then drift apart and then might come back together again. So some people realize that what we call hybridization of creatures that might be starting to drift apart as a species then introduces greater evolutionary change. So this is a gradual divergence that happens over a long period of time, or we might call it the gradual emergence of a number of species. How do we know if we find a fossil from this time, whether it's an ape or a hominin? So we're looking at a number of anatomical changes and a number of perhaps dietary changes, and we'll talk about each of those in turn. But when you're looking at the fossils from this period, it's difficult to tell whether you would classify it as an ape or hominin, because this is precisely the period of gradual divergence. And so today we're going back into that 6 to 9 million year ago period. We'll come up all the way to around 2.5 million years ago with some of the tool making stuff that we observe. But I want to stress that all throughout this period, what we're going to see, as our book shows you, is this very complex process in which different creatures branch off, and it's hard sometimes to tell whether they're on the main evolutionary line or not. And so when we look back at some of these creatures, we're tempted to think that they are us or us in the past. But actually, a lot of these are quite different from us, and some of the fossils that we find are very interesting on their own and may have even made it for a million years or so, which is a pretty good run, evolutionarily speaking, but they don't become part of our own evolutionary history. So the human origin story is very complicated. There's many branches and mysteries to it. And I want to talk about a little bit about why it is that there's so many mysteries, debates within evolution, and complexities in what we're finding. In a lot of this region, we depend on a very small amount of fossil evidence. We've talked about how many teeth we have and how often we are deriving or deducing things from the teeth that we find, in part because those are the best preserved fossils that we have. Our textbooks notes that there are some creatures that we only have one tooth for. And we're trying to figure out what that creature was like based on a single tooth. So hopefully we get more than a single tooth. Hopefully we get more information than that. But sometimes all you have are a few teeth. And so we get a lot from teeth as we might get some information about diet and other things. But the fact of the matter is that the fossil record is fragmentary. Most of our lives as creatures, we spend trying not to be fossils, spend trying to live, not to die, not to get stuck in tar pits and other kinds of things. And so most of the time, this is not going to be something that you find creatures becoming. And by the way, for most creatures, when they're living and say you die, what is going to happen to you if you're out there? You're alive and then you happen to die and for some reason. What's the next thing that's going to happen? You get eaten. That's right. Somebody else comes along and scavenges you and eats everything you have. And so the truth of the matter is that there are only some regions or parts of the world that have been productive in terms of the fossils that they have. So your textbook gives you the region of East Africa, for example, has been a very productive place for finding fossils. That doesn't mean that it was the only place that things happened. Things were they were definitely happening in West Africa and South Africa. We've recently found some stuff in Morocco, Northern Africa, but these other regions are, because of their climate and other characteristics, have not been good for producing fossils. The other thing is that there are often large time gaps between when fossils are found. So even in the regions that might be productive, like East Africa, there might be a long time, say a million years, between one fossils that you have and then another time period in which we have more fossils. And even if you have fossils, what's hard about those fossils? It takes a lot of research, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money. We've increasingly understood that even some of the techniques that we use to date the fossils can be destructive of them. So people are more careful about how they use to date the fossils. Our dates, we think, are getting more accurate, but a lot of the things have to be reanalyzed in terms of some of the old dates that we had were not as accurate as the ones that we're getting now. The other problem is trying to figure out, what we want to find out is, how many species do we have? Let's first go back to, what is a species? How do we know what a species is in our biology classes? When do we know that we have a species? Maybe we should have done this back in the day when we were talking about human groups and races and stuff like that. It's been too long. How do we know that we get a species? Put it to you this way. How do we know that horses and donkeys are separate species? Yes. Yeah, so if you get a horse and a donkey together, they make a mule, but the mules can't reproduce with each other. So when we have a species, that's the whole definition of having a species, is they can interbreed with each other and have fertile interbreeding offspring. Now, Leo, let's go back to your point, which is you dig up a bone and you've got a tooth or a bone and you maybe even have a pelvis, but how the hell are you going to tell if that bone or tooth could have interbred with something that might be similar to it? You see what I'm saying? Very difficult to tell interbreeding species from fossils alone, right? Extremely hard. In fact, even in today's world, it's very difficult to tell interbreeding species from anatomy alone. A lot of the things that we thought were species, if you get them together, they can actually reproduce and have viable offspring. That's how now you can go to some zoos and see a liger that's a combination of a lion and a tiger. Turns out they weren't that separate anyway, but they didn't want to reproduce in the wild. Coyotes, dogs, and wolves are all one big interbreeding species. You can get them all together and have viable offspring. So how do we know that this was true in the past? There are some people who like to lump everything together. So they'll find a bone and they'll be like, this bone is just part of this other species, no big deal. But there's also the splitters, they call them, who find a bone or a tooth and are like, this is a whole new species. And in fact, let's give it a new name based on my name, because it's always fun to name a species and you can give it a name and be happy. So these have been huge debates within paleoanthropology and the whole Paleolithic study of this time period. And it leads to a lot of complexities. In the old days, what we used to believe about human evolution is that we were looking for those big brains. Humans like to believe that we're super smart and smarter than any creatures in the world. And so we believed that what we would find if we looked back on the evolutionary record is creatures that were smart like us. And so we were looking for big brains back then, and we were looking for this idea of intermediary creatures, or what we called missing links. And the idea of missing links actually has a long history, and it goes back to ideas that come to us from the Middle Ages about the great chain of being and how the world's creation was organized. And the idea was that you had to find the link between each of these creatures, and that's how evolution worked. This led to some scientists being very easily hoaxed or duped. There was a very famous hoax called Piltdown Man, where they took a chimpanzee jaw together with a human skull and said that it was an old missing link, and people got all excited about it. But part of that had to do with this expectation that we were looking for big-brained chimps that had gradually changed. Again, in the old days, there weren't as many fossils and as much genetic evidence as we have. And so people were looking for these very smooth transitions. And people believed there was one track of evolution or a single way in which creatures evolved from one to the next. This was again in part because, say, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, there was only fossil evidence and there wasn't that much of it. And so it was in some ways easier to have this idea that everything was arranged along a nice straight line because that's the only evidence that we had. The other thing that people believed is that you had to have anatomical or biological change first. You had to have those big brains. And once you had the big brains, then you could get learning and tool use and eventually what we would call culture or transmitted behavior from one to the next. So this is what people were looking for, say, maybe as late as 60 years ago in human evolution, this idea that we're looking for the smooth big brains that would give us everything we have now. Well, we think now a lot more complex. As we said, we're looking for common ancestors. So the idea of missing links, again, is this outdated idea in evolution. We're looking for creatures that would then derive into or give way into other creatures from before. Amir, we're still looking for those big brains. Long time ago, what's the first thing that probably happened? Big brains, or what are you looking for back in the past?
Brains, legs.
Yeah, we're now much more convinced that it was bipedalism first, around 7 million years ago, which was the defining feature that started to separate out some of these hominin creatures that were walking around on two legs, apart from the lines that would give way to other apes. We don't see bigger brains until about 2.5 or 3 million years ago. So we would have bipedal or habitually bipedal creatures around 7 million years ago, but we don't see any significant increase in brain size for another 4 million years. How many bipedal species were there? No, it's a trick question. Lots. There are lots of them, or we don't know how many. In part because it's hard to say, were these actually species or were they variation within a species? But there was a large diversity of species that were developing in this transition period when we have hominin species or bipedal up to eventually creatures that we'd classify in the Homo lineages, which is the same lineage that we think of ourselves in. So we see across this time a number of different bipedal species. And so instead of thinking about one smooth line or one single track of evolution, people now talk about, as I mentioned, hybridization, how creatures might split off for a while from each other, but then come back together and their genetics recombine. People talk about bushy evolution. So instead of one branch or line, that things go off in a bush. And we also talk about something that is called the mosaic of traits. There's that different traits arise at different time periods. And so it's difficult to tell from one single trait if you're necessarily going to have one age of evolution. Some of these start combining and recombining in different ways over this time period. In addition to the fossil evidence, we now have more of, but not a ton. We now do a lot of genetic stuff, as we've talked about, the molecular clock, a lot of the geology. We've gotten better reconstructions of what climate and the landscape might have been like when these creatures were emerging. So we have a much fuller expert picture of what the world might have been like back then. One of the big surprises of the last 20 years or so is that getting the genetic evidence on our lineage and the lineage of some of these creatures has actually made things more complicated or helped us tell a more complex story of human evolution. In the old days, we believed that once we got this genetic evidence that we'd be able to simplify everything because unlike fossils where you have to do maybe a lot of interpretation, the genetic stuff seemed more straightforward. But what the genetic stuff has revealed is that evolution doesn't occur as simply as we thought. And so a lot of the complex changes that we talked about in terms of the genetic code occur over a long time period, and again with the hybridization of creatures into each other. And then there's something that's extremely important, especially for studying anthropology and learning and culture and tools and things like that. It's hard to say exactly what happened, but it seems like these things are intertwined with each other. So when we talk about creatures learning from each other, using tools, and transmitting their knowledge from generation to generation, this is something that seems to have started at least 2.5 million years ago. So a long time ago. And it is interconnected with our changing biology. So remember that I told you that in the old days, we're looking for those big brains because we thought we needed big brains to make tools. Turns out you don't necessarily need big brains to make tools, but the process of making those tools and passing that knowledge along can result in a biological changes, which leads to the kinds of creatures that we see more like in the last 2 million years ago, and of course, our own lineage today. All right, that gives us a sort of large scale overview